Hi, I think you enjoyed hearing a little bit about my father, and now I'm going to tell you about my mother. Here is her picture. Both photographs were taken when they were married 35 years. Her name was Mollie Fischer Toiv. My grandmother, Flora Fischer, was born in New York City in the 1850s after her parents arrived from Austria. She had a twin sister, Fanny, and I recall they looked alike even when they were in their 80s. They had a brother, Isaac Tuck, who fought in the Civil War and unfortunately died in the Battle of Five Forks, Virginia, near the end of the war. And he's buried in the military cemetery in Petersburg, Virginia. He was 21 years old. During that time, if someone was called to serve and didn't want to, he could pay someone else to go in his place. My great uncle accepted $50 from a John T. Hawkins to be his substitute, as his mother was needy and $50 was a great deal of money. And then he lost his young life in battle. My grandmother and her husband Nathan had 8 children, 5 girls and 3 boys, and my mother was the second youngest. They lived in the Lower East Side of New York City, which was heavily populated by immigrants of all nationalities. The families lived in very small apartments in high buildings called tenements, and everyone struggled to make enough money to feed their families. My grandfather died young, and my grandmother was supported by her children, who had to drop out of school when they were very young and go to work. My mother told me once that as each child came home with a paycheck, her mother would go to buy food for a few days. Now, when a woman is left alone and has to support her children, the government helps each family so that the children can stay in school. I'm going to tell you a funny story. Sometimes when mothers want to call a child by name, she automatically calls out a couple of names before she gets to the one she wants. My mother's family all had names or nicknames that ended in the E sound. And my mother once told me that her mother would start with Becky, Nettie, Bertie, Mollie, and Julie before she got to the right one. Her brothers were Ike, Jake, and Izzy. Now for my mother. She was born in 1898 and married my father when she was 22. I know she enjoyed her life growing up even though she had to work early on. She was a small woman, had many friends, and was always cheerful and good-natured. She and all the children in the neighborhood would gather on the steps outside the building called a stoop, and it was there that she excelled in the game of jacks. It's something like pick-up sticks, except that you have to bounce a ball and pick up the little metal figures one at a time without touching the others. Her hands were small and she was agile. Once we sat on the floor and she gave us a demonstration and she was terrific. She wore a size 4 shoe, which happened to be the size the designers used as samples. She would go to the shops and buy beautiful shoes for $1 a pair. She was always ready to try something new, a new card game, a trip somewhere, an unusual recipe. When she was about 70, she told me she had a date once with a young man who took her off on a motorcycle, and that was so much fun. That was 1919. My mother's role in life was to be a good wife and mother as well as the best daughter-in-law. My grandmother arrived from Europe, spoke no English, had had a very difficult life, was very religious, and not happy living anywhere. But my mother took her in and made the best of it without complaint. My father's family declared that my mother was the kindest and best natured in the entire family. I never heard her make an unkind comment about anyone. She was optimistic even when everyone else was depressed. My parents had 3 children, Leonard, then me, and Norma. I think Len was most like her, generous and non-confrontational. Norma and I were more like my father's family, who were a bit more rigid. It's interesting to note that if each child in a family is interviewed individually, they remember entirely different incidents as being highlights. My mother was a wonderful cook, and Dad loved eating at her table. Of course, when we all sat down to eat, my father was served first. It was a mark of respect, and he was well respected. There were so many choices, all well seasoned and cooked to perfection. She used every pot she owned, and we had to clean up after her, but the result was worth it. Dad and I lived with her for 3 months after we were hit by a flood in Wilkes-Barre. My father had died, and it was as if she had a new purpose in her life. Each day after shoveling mud in Wilkes-Barre, we would get to Scranton and would find a delicious meal and a hot shower. We were very appreciative, as you can imagine. Her education was limited, as I told you, but when she was in business, she didn't even need a pencil to figure out that if an item was a certain price per dozen wholesale, she would immediately know what the retail price should be. Her ability with numbers was uncanny. She would tell me what she paid for Leonard's diapers and blankets, then mine, then Norma's, following with the cost of layouts for every grandchild, which my parents provided, remembering every single figure 50 years later. If I remember facts, it's because of my mother. She knew nothing about sewing, however. Each Sunday when they visited, I would ask if something needed alterations, and would discover often that she gave a Band-Aid treatment to a hem, or a button was loose, and I would give her a robe. She would take her dress off and I'd get to work. If she had a black dress and she had a needle with white thread, she'd fix the hem with white thread, and vice versa. Forget buttons. My father had to sew on all the buttons. She crocheted very well, but sewing was too challenging. But because we stayed on top of things, she was always well dressed and proud of her appearance. My father was a terrible driver, never even looking in the rearview mirror, and driving 25 to 30 miles per hour. They were often lost, and my mother would say, "I tried to see what street we were on, but your father speeds through the intersection and doesn't even give me a chance to look." And he always missed the driveway next to our house and dug out the grass. Dad always told him he would have to pay for an extra strip of concrete. When my father was 80, we celebrated with a lovely family dinner. My brother Leonard, champagne glass in hand, rose and made a toast. My father held his hand up and said, "Please wait, I want to toast your mother, because without her I would never have lived to be 80. I can go on forever, but I think you get the idea. Both of my parents would be overjoyed to see how their family blossomed after their humble beginnings."